See if there's anything there. Oh my gosh, I couldn't afford one that had such an appetite.
I wouldn't want one.
They're wonderful companion. I mean, all dogs are wonderful
We've had dogs over the
companions.
years. We like being dog free.
We did, we took every
Yeah,
safeguard
we did
could.
everything.
I never had a big dog. I wouldn't want a big dog.
Well, there we go.
Am I early or am I okay?
You're just fine.
You're always
Actually, a
okay.
little early. Welcome. Please make yourself comfortable there, Mr. Craig. I'm Dave Friend, Chairman of the MUD Board, and we'll have the other board members introduce themselves, please.
Jim Begley.
Mike McGowan.
Gwen Howard.
Jack Frost.
Tim Kavanaugh. Welcome.
Thank you.
We have a structured interview process, and Mr. Begley will pose all of the questions, and each candidate is asked the same questions, and we have allotted each candidate the same time of 1 hour, so.
All set, sir?
I am.
All right. To begin, please take 5 minutes and tell us why you think this is the right opportunity for you at this point in your career, and why you think you might be the right leader for MUD.
That's a great question. First, I want to thank you for the opportunity to interview. It's important to me, quite obviously. And second, I want to acknowledge the many outstanding people and organizations that I've worked for and with. I've really been fortunate to be able to do that. This is another potential great opportunity to do that. And any success that I've had is really a credit to the people that I've worked for and with. So with that, my career path has been varied. I started at the local level, if I went back years. Part of it was water. Spent time in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers around the world with varied assignments, again, including water. Potable water is what one of the missions for the Army Corps of Engineers. Final assignment was actually here in Omaha on West Center Road. I was the Deputy Division Engineer for the Missouri River Division. That division no longer exists. It's been consolidated. I spent the last year with the Corps consolidating the division with the North Pacific Division in Portland, Oregon, into a new division called the Northwestern Division, responsible for most of the northwest 1/4 of the United States. Again, there were water issues there as well, potable water included. Shortly after I finished my military career, and this speaks more directly to your question, the newly elected governor of the state of Nebraska invited me to be his director of the Department of Roads. Now, that has changed, the name has changed to the Department of Transportation, but it's still essentially the same organization. And when I was reviewing and researching the job description and MUD's organization, how they operate, I was struck how similar it was to many organizations that I've served in, including the Department of Roads. You might not recognize that on the surface, but it is. And so I'll start with MUD's mission. And then it trickles down. It really falls from there to the very bottom of MUD. MUD's mission statement says we provide safe, reliable, cost-effective service to our community. Now, you could substitute the word customers for community, but those words mean something to me. They are familiar to me. And in fact, many of the organizations, and I'll say the Department of Roads, had those words as part of our mission and work in the Department of Roads. You could talk about the Department of Roads as a utility. And I'm going to say that transportation is going to increasingly look like a utility. Someday it probably will. So there is more than a casual comparison between something like the Department of Roads and MUD. Cash funded, have customers, do planning, design, construction, and operations and maintenance. Those are similar. When I drive by a work site on the side of the road, I'm reminded of the Department of Roads work. Shortly after I got to the Department of Roads, I recognized that the Department of Roads owns a lot of public right-of-way, as do cities and counties. You know that. And utilities commonly locate on that right-of-way. So I reached out to utilities across the state, including MUD, to open up the lines of communications, to strengthen the relationship, and generally find ways of doing things better together. A couple of examples, and then I'll wrap up here because I'm at 5 minutes. We initiated common overlays that both the utilities and the Department of Roads could use that identified more precisely our assets for use primarily during the planning and design, but also to avoid conflicts during construction, and it occurs. Speaking of construction, and I alluded to this a few minutes ago, that is an awful lot of what we do, and MUD does, is construction and maintenance. It's a big system. All those words that are in the mission statement, that's why they mean something to me. Safety, cost-effective, reliable. Those are things that keep our community, in this case, our society, operating smoothly. And then it's the question of how do you continually maintain it and improve it and so on and so forth. The last thing I'd say, and I'll speak directly to the Department of Roads, but I could talk about, it's similar for my work in Oregon for 6 years. We performed at the highest level on record. That's what we're doing when I left the Department of Roads. That means something to me. In Oregon, we completed the program on schedule, under budget. We'd won 70 awards, and we had outstanding relationships, which I think I'm most proud of, with partner stakeholders and the state of Oregon. And we worked very close. We had a utility section. We worked very closely with utilities and worked with them, very similar to what we did in Nebraska. So in direct response to your question, Mr. Begley, is I believe that I have the experience and the expertise and the people and delivery skills, I'll call it result skills, to serve MUD and its customers. There's a lot to leadership, and I acknowledge that, but I absolutely believe I have the skills to come in and help.
What year were you appointed to the Department of Roads, now Transportation?
1999.
Thank you.
And then I served through most of 2009, so that was my duration.
Thank you.
Actually, that was the second longest serving DOT director in the country at the time, which is a bit unusual for various reasons. So,
Describe in detail your utility or business experience that includes managing large capital-intensive projects. Please highlight gas or water experience if applicable.
well, let me speak to Nebraska, and then I'll try and switch over to Oregon. I'll start with Oregon. In Oregon, I was invited by Fluor Enterprises and HDR Engineering to move to Oregon. This was towards the end of my service to Nebraska. But I was invited by Fluor Enterprises and HDR Engineering to move to Oregon and to lead their joint venture, which was organized as a separate operating company, to deliver a long-duration, complex mega program. That's how it read. We did that. The program completed on schedule, was under budget, 70 awards. We had outstanding relationships. I'd mentioned that earlier. The one thing I didn't mention, and this speaks to, I think, to performance, that program in Oregon has been recognized as the most successful public works program in Oregon history. There's a lot to that. There's a lot that underlies it, right? So you can only be a little bit superficial here. But there's a lot that went into that, a lot of hard work by an awful lot of people. I mentioned that the roads business, roads and bridges, other forms of transportation operate very similar to a utility. I mentioned starting with the mission statement, but working its way down. If I squinted my eyes just a little bit, looking at the various documents that MUD has, I could be talking about work in Oregon, the Department of Roads. There's very little difference. The business functions are almost the same. Very little difference. And I might have some comments about some of the things, but my other conclusion from that is it's very strong. MUD is a very strong, even world-class organization. I looked at the data. I looked at turnover rates for personnel, so on and so forth. So I'll say straight up, I have little or no experience with gas. I mentioned that I have had some experience with water, but as a utility itself, hold that, I have not. But the differences between organizations for the last 2 decades easily and a utility, very little different. They are very familiar. We could take any particular topic, and I think I could easily speak to it. I'm comfortable with what, that is why I applied for the job in the first place. It was a remarkable comparison between my experience in the organizations and how they operate in MUD. I didn't expect that, quite frankly, so.
Describe your exposure or experience working with an elected or appointed board of directors.
That's a great question. Well, I was appointed, I mentioned, I'll go back to Nebraska and Oregon because that's my most recent experience. I could talk about my own consulting firm now, but I'll probably leave that alone for the moment. I was appointed by 2 governors. I worked with the state legislature, including a great many state senators, of which every 3 years I would try and meet with them individually wherever they wanted to meet. Their breakfast table, a restaurant, to strengthen the relationship, provide some information, but also to solicit their issues and then respond back to them. Whether or not I could do anything about them, that was another issue, but that was the whole intent. So that was the state legislature. Cities and counties, after I'd been in the department for 2 or 3 years, I thought, you know, I need to strengthen the relationship with cities and counties. And so I went out and visited with the mayor and whomever else they wanted to bring in, typically appointed officials, public works directors, all the first-class and second-class cities in the state. It took some time, but it was worth it. Again, I would give a little bit of a presentation, update, you know, what the Department of Roads is doing, but I was primarily there to listen. There is another operative word. I do a lot of listening. I think that is important, and I'm already talking more than I would rather. I enjoy listening because I think feedback is the breakfast of champions. When I went to Oregon, it was a bit different. Actually, I went to Oregon to gain, I thought part of the education of John Craig that was missing was private sector experience. And so I actively sought an opportunity to do that, and I was invited to go to Oregon and did that. We had a joint venture board, a little bit different. So three executives from Floor Enterprises, which does mostly big work internationally, and then HR Engineering, which is from Omaha, and they do mostly still domestic work. And so I worked for them. That was a little bit different. And then I'll caveat it. Part of the reason I believe, without having ever been told this, went to Oregon, they had some issues, and of course I had been a DOT director, and I was the owner's representative. Now, if you'd asked me what an owner's representative was before I went out there, I'm not sure I could tell you, but I was as close to being a director of a DOT as I could be, but I was in the private sector. And there was a good deal of trust and faith that developed. So as a result, as we built that trust and mutual respect, I was invited to talk to state senators. Sometimes they would call me, and there were times where I'd say, I can't answer that. You need to talk directly to the DOT. I am a consultant, but they knew who I was. They knew I had some experience. And so I worked with the Highway Commission. That was Transportation Commission in Oregon. I also worked with the appointed State Highway Commission very closely here in Nebraska. Many of the people you would recognize. Dwayne Ackley, on, great people. Sorry to see Dwayne pass away here this last year or so. So I have worked with appointed and elected boards and commissions on a regular basis. It's familiar. It's kind of a hand-in-glove relationship. Each one operates a little bit different. And I'll point to the Highway Commission. It's still called the Highway Commission. Someday it'll switch to the Transportation Commission. They're advisory, but there was never a time, they would provide advice and assistance. They're great people, great public servants, as you all are. You're not getting paid enough money to do this, and I recognize that. The commission, why they officially were responsible to provide advice and assistance, there was never a time that we did not take their advice and assistance. I was an ex officio member, so there was one time in over 10 years where I had to vote on something to tip the scales. There were eight commissioners. So it's a hand-in-glove relationship. It's a close relationship. When the boards or commissions speak, you listen. There's a reason for that, many reasons. So most of the time, I think people are aligned, but not always. And so I have a good deal of experience doing that. I'm quite comfortable in working with elected and appointed boards and commissions. No question about it. Both in the public sector and the private sector, I'm comfortable. It's a little bit different, but nonetheless, quite comfortable with it.
Do you have any experience driving new revenue streams or product development?
Yes. New revenue streams. Now, this will be a little bit, no, I'll speak to Oregon first, and then I'll speak to Nebraska. Nebraska is a little different because I was a public employee working for the governor and under the in close relationship with the state legislature. In Oregon, it was a $1.3 billion program. We delivered that. I talked about that. Because we were doing very well, and we had a very good relationship, and in many ways we could do things at less expense because when the people weren't needed, we'd shed them. We'd get rid of the people out of the joint venture. Half my employees were floor, half were HDR. The Oregon Department of Transportation asked us to do another $700 million of work, a little over $2 billion of work. That was not part of the original program because they liked what we were doing. And frankly, they didn't have enough employees and they didn't have a real mechanism to grow their workforce. So we were augmenting their workforce, and Fluor and HDR benefited by that additional $700 million or so of additional work. When we completed the program, I negotiated, actually there was other negotiations that went on for contracts, but when we completed the program, I negotiated a follow-on contract that existed and went to HDR because there's an HDR office in Salem, Oregon that was not for Fluor. And so there was an additional revenue stream that HDR enjoyed, and it's the private sector. Switching over to the Department of Roads, cash-funded organization. I could talk about how all that works, and it's to some extent deliberately complex, but that's not the purpose here. Worked for governors as the vernacular goes, the legislature proposes and the governor disposes. So knowing that, I was not in a position to advocate for additional funding. But my job was to say, what are the needs? These are the needs over the next 20 years, 20-year needs assessment for the Department of Roads. And I recognize from what I've seen, there's some kind of a needs assessment within MUD. I just don't have enough insight to see exactly what that is or if it could be improved. And so that 20-year needs assessment was in effect, and there's never enough money anywhere. So it's all about setting priorities and somebody making a decision, okay, how much money can we afford right now that we would provide that needs assessment to the legislature, and there was a unique hearing between the Transportation and Appropriations Committee every year that I would report, here's the needs of the state highway system. To some regret, it wasn't larger transportation, but that's the way the law reads, the needs of the state highway system over the next 20 years. So the legislature and the governor would have some idea, okay, what's the target out there that needs to be funded, knowing that you're not going to be able to fund that much, but how much can we? At least make informed decisions. And so when we did that, that was a way to kind of keep on the table that, you know, we could always use more money. Well, as a practical matter, that's not always possible. It's just not. And then I would talk a bit about, okay, how do we prioritize, or how are we refining how we prioritize doing our work to get the biggest bang for our buck, so to speak. And so we did that. I always felt like in the public sector, I used to think to myself, the currency of the future was trust, giving people the facts, developing trust that they could count on us to spend their money wisely and not waste it. I can say when I went to Oregon, there was not a comfortable relationship between the elected officials, legislature, and the governor and how the DOT there operated. I think that's something that I was helped bring out there. So we did that. We also competed for, but it was relatively speaking, a small amount of funds. We competed for grants and other sources of funding from primarily the US DOT, but probably some others. So we, state legislature, and as I say, the Department of Roads, I believe we had pretty high credibility, and we measured that. We did surveys of groups of people, including the state legislature and the public, on a regular basis, that it was pretty high. It was about what I saw from the public surveys for MUD, and those are very good marks, I believe. You can't make everybody happy, but do the very best you can do and continue to improve. That trust and credibility, it's the trajectory, I believe, has continued in the Department of Roads, now the Department of Transportation. And here in the last few years, they increased the state fuel tax 6 cents. I can tell you that's not popular for any public official, but it was. Actually, as I recall, they overrode the governor. But nonetheless, I think that trajectory and that trust and mutual respect and credibility enables you, especially in the public sector, to say, you know, we could use more money. This is the target out there over some longer period of time, and then you come to grips with, okay, what's the right amount of money to be generated? What's the right rate for MUD to generate, to require? That can be done. At the same time, knowing part of our job, part of my job, I feel like, and I would bring this to MUD, is to find ways to be more efficient, to continue to improve, and to be more cost-effective. That's in the mission statement, and I would say to find ways to reduce the costs. That's a continuous process. There are a couple of big items out there that I think help do that. One's called the rapid acceleration of digital technology, and it's evolving very, very quickly, and there are opportunities that are there now, I believe, and there are ones that are going to be there not too distant future. The other item is collaboration. And I think when you begin to pool your money, and I'll say back to the Department of Roads, law enforcement, including the Nebraska State Patrol and others, you can pool your resources, and I'll point to the State Operations Center. Actually, it's also the District 2 Operations Center here in Omaha, where the Department of Roads and the State Patrol are located in exactly the same facility in an operations center. We pooled our funds. The Department of Roads, because of the budget, we were the heavy, but we pooled our funds, pooled our resources, pooled our efforts. And so when I say collaboration, that that is another mechanism to help you do more with less, and that is the name of the game, especially when you're serving your customers. Nobody wants to pay more if they can avoid it, so.
Describe your experience working with a senior leadership team to define and develop short and long-term strategic plans, including driving change in the company culture to support those plans.
And I'll go back to the Department of Roads. You pick up ideas, you scan the environment to say, all right, what's going on? What are others doing? What are good practices? What are best practices? So on and so forth. And so after a couple of years in the Department of Roads, I recognized that other than the needs assessment and some of the elements, as important as they were, we did not have a state strategic plan for transportation. We called it the Long-Range State Transportation Plan. So we initiated that. That is currently still ongoing and is updated about every 5 years, where you pulled in everybody that has an interest in transportation. In this case, it's not dissimilar to utilities at all, because our society is built on those kinds of its built environment, whether it's utilities, whether it's buildings, whether it's roads and bridges. That's how our society operates and exists. So again, there's not much difference really between utilities and an organization like the Department of Roads. Lose my train of thought here. Could you ask the question one more time,
Sure.
Mr. Bailey?
You bet. Describe your experience working with a senior leadership team to define and develop short and long-term strategic plans, including driving change in the company culture to support those plans.
Thank you.
Sure.
So back to the long-range plan, first to sit down with the leadership team. It was something new, and anytime there is something new, there is almost always some degree of resistance to doing it. I could talk about environmental issues, and there was perhaps more resistance to doing that. But to go back to the strategic plan, the Long-Range State Transportation Plan, we started that as part of the leadership team. And my leadership team, and this evolved a little bit while I was consisted of 2 deputies. There were 4 as a cost-saving measure. We didn't need 4, we really only needed 2. And the personnel director, I had report directly to me, and the controller, the money guy. That was my close-in leadership team. Then very quickly it evolved to people in the field, the district engineers, so on and so forth. But that was my leadership team. So that was the focus for moving the ball forward, moving the long-range state transportation plan and getting work done. So there's not a simple way to summarize how that's done. I would say especially in the last decade or two, most of my skill set is people-based. You got to get results. There is absolutely no question. But I spend a lot of time doing outreach, including with my own employees. In fact, a large part of me says taking good care and talking to and maintaining alignment with my employees, starting with the leadership team, but not entirely, and I'll talk about that in a second. That's more important than the customer, because they're the ones that are going to deliver the results to the customer. You've got to keep alignment and focus by your own employees. They are the ones that are delivering the service. It's not the guy at the top. Some cases, in many cases, they're the most expendable person in the organization, in my opinion. You're responsible and accountable for everything in the organization, but those employees, they're the ones that deliver projects and services to the customers. They are the most important. Maybe not be popular in certain audiences to say that, but that's my belief. So I'll go back to the long-range state transportation plan and then try and work that down a little bit. You end up with goals in that. And I mentioned we involved everybody, which means everybody in the state or representatives of them, cities, counties, fire departments, law enforcement, railroads, aviation, utilities, in that long-range state transportation plan. What is it that we should be doing? And then we spent probably a year or two consolidating that into some kind of a summary, and then you begin to chunk it down. And I'll fast forward and say, you got to have a set of performance measures. What is it exactly, specific and measurably, you're trying to do? And then the question is, how are you doing in terms of getting it? I have a strong tendency to look at the trend lines as opposed to a given point in time. Are you getting better? Are you getting worse, or are you staying level? Or do you need to adjust the goal? Maybe you've got the goal set too high, most likely maybe you've got set too low and you need to increase it. So you can talk about cash flow, you can talk about safety. I've seen the performance measures that MUD has, and they are very familiar to me. In a way, no surprise, but they are. And so, you know, the strategic level, the long-range state transportation, and the development of performance measures with specific and measurable measures, and all the elements that go into it. So you got to have somebody do it. Who's the champion for that? A data system to feed that. I could talk about data for a while because it's fundamental in terms of getting results and maintaining your alignment and focus. There's a lot in between that tactical level and that strategic level, a lot. And frankly, part of the outreach, whether it's with the state legislature or the governor or cities and counties or other partners, law enforcement, fire departments, part of what I would typically do to maintain alignment between all of these employees, partners, and stakeholders is to go out and give them a little bit of an update. In fact, we would have an annual report that was sometimes helpful, and I would make sure I hand that out. And not only talked about it in a narrative, but it had most of the performance measures in a readable format. If it's not quickly graspable, understandable by people, it doesn't serve a very good purpose. So part of the trick is to summarize that down to something that can be used as opposed to some voluminous thing that's got plots of data and you can't make any sense out of it. Those visits and that outreach, that alignment, that's one of the things I think it achieves. It certainly strengthens relationships, keeps lines of communications open, but it maintains alignment. Who are we? What are we doing? And how are we doing in terms of it? What needs to get better? What are we doing really well? And congratulate ourselves. But you know, the question is, how do you make improvements? You can't get complacent. It's especially true for safety, I might add. And complacency is the enemy of safety, I say. But you can't become complacent. And so back to that leadership team, you've got to maintain that focus there, and it's there. Part of the value of the leadership team, whatever you're doing as the person, the guy or gal at the top, the leadership team and everybody else in the organization, but especially the leadership team, multiplies your ability to get things done. They multiply. You can't do it yourself. There's no way. And like I said, you're frequently the most expendable person at the top. And so working with people, keeping them focused, getting their feedback, I generally believe that employees, including the leadership team, but employees from the very bottom to the top, part of the value of going out and listening to them, when I say it's, you get feedback, and feedback's the requisite of champions. More commonly than not, they have the solutions, and they have legitimate recommendations for how to improve. Person at the top, maybe not. So those employees, including the leadership team, is really, really important. And I would credit the leadership team along with all the other employees for any success that I've had, whether it's the Department of Roads or Oregon or anywhere else. I have been extremely fortunate to work with outstanding people. They're the ones that get the credit. And frankly, the person at the top, it's my opinion that you give the credit and you take the blame. It rolls off the tongue a little too easily, perhaps, but that is the truth. That's exactly how I've been taught and what I believe. So that's a response to a pretty simple question. I apologize for that.
Tell us about your experience in driving a customer-centric business strategy.
some things I'm thinking about. I want to be a little bit careful because I'm sitting here in Nebraska, but I'll speak to the Department of Roads again, since we're here in Nebraska. Most of my experience has been coming from the outside of an organization, and over the last couple of decades at the top. So you don't grow up in an organization. You don't know all the ins and outs. You're not familiar, but while you don't have the historical knowledge, the value you bring is objectivity. That is worth a lot. I could talk about the Corps of Engineers and why they have military officers that rotate every 1 or 2 or 3 years in districts and divisions. That is one of the reasons. They bring objectivity. It's a new set of eyes, fresh set of eyes, new ideas. You can ask the questions with relative comfort, the so-called stupid questions. There is no stupid question. And so in the Department of Roads, I recognized and never really, I don't know that I really spoke openly about it, but it's how you do things sometimes. It's more important than what you do. I recognize that the Department of Roads, and there are some similarities in Oregon, but I'll leave that alone. That's going to be a little sensitive too, that they were more concerned about themselves in many cases. I won't say across the board. It depends on the individual. Organizations are made of individuals. So it's hard to clump them as one unit. But the Department of Roads was a little arrogant in terms of they knew what to do. You know, they didn't need anybody else's advice or assistance or even to cooperate or collaborate. It is something I do believe that I brought to them. You know, if you're going to change a culture and change things, you know, you can come in and bang your fist, but it doesn't happen that way. It happens slowly, talking to people, see them, convincing them, getting to know them. They trust you, you trust them. So you begin to talk about customers. They're the ones that are important. We need to listen to them. And then you lead by example. And I think that carries some weight. People follow models and follow examples. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of them do. And so that was part of my intent by going out and visiting with mayors and county commissioners and public works directors, the legislature, 1/3 of them every year. There were probably 1 or 2 that I missed, but there were various reasons for that. Utilities, it's probably the last time I was in this building is when I came to CMUD or OPPD or NPPD or other utilities across the state, or law enforcement or fire departments. I met with those people. And part of it was to get their feedback, again, strengthen the relationship, open up the lines of communications, but part of it was to set the example and a model that these are our friends. If we can find a way to work together, guess what? We're gonna perform better, and we're probably gonna enjoy our work more, which I think is awfully important. If you're having fun and enjoying what you're doing, that is worth a lot. It's probably underrated. And when you find good people to work with, they don't have to be employees. They're partners and stakeholders. That means a lot. And so I think that is how I helped change the culture, and it's a continuous process. You don't build a relationship and then ignore it. It takes continuous attention and feeding. So it's not, I'm not saying you do it here because those relationships and trust and mutual respect can disappear quickly, and they're really hard to recover. Sometimes they're impossible to recover. So it's a continuous process. And so I think to the customer, whether it's a long-range state transportation plan, which I had a crew that went around the state to reflect it in public meetings over a couple of years, get their feedback, their responses, or other elements of outreach, and keeping the focus on the customer at the same time you are taking good care of your own employees you're mentoring them along. So it's not a heavy-handed approach. It takes time if it's going to stick. It's team development, both within the organization and outside. There's a closer team, and then there's a broader team. And it's in my opinion, there's nothing more powerful than a team with a common purpose. There isn't. You can talk about football, right? We're all going to see how football works out. It's really important. And so focusing on the customer, that was part of my education on the private sector. It's the client, but there's really no difference. There are people you're dealing with. So keeping the focus on what's important, which is the customer. That's why I mentioned in the MUD's mission statement, it says community, which I get that, but I could easily substitute the word customer because that is what it's about. We could argue about the details, but semantics sometimes it serves no purpose. You keep the focus on things, you work with people, you reach out and talk to them face to face, you get their feedback, you give them a little feedback. And those performance measures that are over here, if they are not serving the customer ultimately, the question is, why do you even have them? I mean, you should be able to link everything from the top to the bottom of the organization, including those performance engines, back to what are you trying to accomplish? Who are you trying to serve? Oh, if you're trying to serve the customer, are those doing that? If they're just measuring process that doesn't link back to the customer, that ultimate end, then it begs the question, why do you have it? And we've gone through that sometimes in organizations I've been in. Why do we have this performance measure? We need a better one because it's not really measuring what we want it to measure. So that's long response to a simple question.
Describe your experience guiding organizations in the interpretation and/or implementation of regulations from legislative or regulatory bodies.
Another good question. That, normally when I come into an organization, they spend a lot of time educating me, which I welcome, because there's objectivity comes with that. I want to hear from people, I want to listen. Talking about rules and regulations and laws, I had a small section of 2 people that they used to be called, this is the Department of Roads, legislative liaison, but it was government affairs. I noticed the same thing in minutes for this board. They would do a report periodically on, okay, what's going on legislatively. And so that's exactly what my government affairs section would do. These are bills that we'd kind of put them in different categories. These are ones just to monitor. Here's ones that are going to have an impact on us. In fact, we would have to do legislative impact statements. What's the impact to us or the transportation system, including economically? So we measured those. They were important. And then there was typically a discussion, including with the governor's office, okay, do you testify on this particular bill or not? And there it was pretty rigorous in terms of they would, the governor's office had final approval on what was it going to say. You develop a script, and then you were there responding to questions just like here. The federal government, and this is one of the things I'm really pleased with, and it still continues. At some point in time, and it probably was at least 2 or 3 years, I recognized, boy, we need to be talking to our congressional delegation. And practically speaking, it's easier to do because there are only 2 senators and 3 congressmen or congresswomen. And so we started a quarterly meeting that usually would not have the principals on it, but either in person or most frequently a conference call. But every quarter, the entire congressional delegation was on the phone. And I would have my leadership team or whatever other people I needed in the room. It was in the commission room, much like this, around a table. And we would have an hour or so conference call. Sometimes just catching up, sometimes talking about what is it that we need in Nebraska? Because they didn't know. I mean, they had access to reports or whatnot, but they needed to hear from us. And it was a two-way street. And that continues to this day. I happen to be aware of that. It worked out even better than I thought. And it was, I have to say, it was enjoyable and comfortable to some extent because we were communicating, we were talking. Part of it was driven by, and I could talk about this a while, we were a net donor state in Nebraska as an example. And I could talk about that. That's not necessarily unfair, but we were, and that was one of the things that I think triggered, we need to talk to our congressional delegation too, and what do we need, and what rules and regulations are out there or need to be changed or being considered in law. We could talk about the cash flow and the federal fuel tax. You know, we had both cash funding from the federal government and the state government. So I think I have a good deal of experience, and it's familiar from what I've seen with MUD in terms of working with elected and appointed officials, the legislatures, federal government, the lawmakers at the federal level. And I'm not sure how exactly that operates here in MUD, but I recognize that it operates. And it's important. And there's another item that I went, boy, this is familiar. I could to this substitute a name and say this is exactly what my staff did for me. And I'll say that it's most of the time I'm more dependent on my staff than they are on me. There is a hand-in-glove relationship. They're the experts. They are. That's why they're doing what they do. I would never propose, since Bonnie greeted me here very, very kindly as I came in the building, you wouldn't want me as an HR expert. You wouldn't want me a designer. That's not what I do. That's not my skill set. That's not my experience, nor what I'm good at, nor even what I enjoy. But combining all of those things, including with governmental affairs issues, it's what I do, harmonizing it, making things work. It's a little bit like being a conductor, so.
Discuss your leadership and communication style and/or skills.
If I had to say, here's John Craig's leadership style, I'd say it's people-based and results-driven. You got to have both. But I will say I have a propensity to focus more on people than the results. And part of that, I think, is well-founded, that people are the ones that get results. Do I get any results? I don't think I ever do. That's why I credit the people that I've worked with and for, great people. That's really the secret to success, in my opinion, is surround yourself with great people. Help them. Be a servant leader, if you will. So that's my leadership style, people-based, results-driven. There's a lot of aspects to that. Everybody is a leader in an organization. I'm happy to say that. It could be the janitor, the lowest level maintenance worker. There is a leadership for all of those people. You don't have to be in a position. Leadership is not a position. It's what you do. And so to acknowledge that, I think, causes some people to adjust their thinking and go, well, if you do empowerment and delegate and, of course, hold people accountable and so on and so forth, people will do amazing things. They will serve the customer, and they'll be proud of it. And so under the leadership umbrella, I'd say my job is to be accountable and responsible for everything that does or does not occur within an organization. That's my role. It doesn't mean that other people aren't accountable or responsible, but I am responsible for the organization. Own it. That's my job. That's what I've been taught. Somewhere I probably kept learning it along the way, but I've been taught that. You set the direction. whether it's a long-range plan or strategic plan, you, like I said, you do outreach internally and externally to maintain alignment to make sure you're getting results. There's a lot of components, I think, to leadership. You're transparent. You report openly on the results you're giving. What are the rates? What are you getting done in MUD? What are you not? So that people can see it. And it's on the website. That's a very good thing, where I really had most of my access to MUD. And then finally, I'm going to put it this way, that you set the direction, the strategic direction, and then you look for getting results. In between, I'll say you're a servant leader. That's an easy way to put it. You're the servant to everybody else. They're getting the job done. And at the end of the day, you say, thank you for what you did. And I think that's an underused word, is appreciating people and thanking people. And it can be a simple thank you, but there are other mechanisms for doing that as well. I think it's a powerful tool, and they deserve it. Take care of people that are working for you. They're going to take good care of the customer, no question. So that's a longer response to a very simple question than I would have hoped.
Sure. And in fairness to you, we have about 3 questions. We do have 3 questions left and a Q&A opportunity for you to ask us questions.
Great.
We have about 10 minutes left, so I just want to
Great.
give you
Thank you.
a time update on that. Tell us about a time when you took over leadership of a team or organization. What did you do to build support, rapport, and trust quickly and effectively?
I'll talk to Oregon, and since I was working for people that are in Omaha, actually the person that hired me is now the chairman of HDR Inc., Eric. I was invited to move to Oregon by Fluor and HDR, but also with an interview and approval by the Oregon Department of Transportation and a little broader group as well. There were issues that they had, and I'll say, I'm trying to pick my words carefully, they needed a new set of eyes. They needed to be turned around. The relationship was not good. The issues were not technical. There were people issues. It's easier to see, I think, coming in from the outside. And there were personalities, but there are personalities everywhere. It's always the case. And then you find a way to work things and to make it better. So one of the early things I did with the Oregon Department of Transportation, their major projects section, which doesn't exist anymore, they developed a separate section just to oversee us, because we delivered about half of their annual program, so it was a substantial piece. And I was doing an adjustment. I was adjusting from being in the public sector as a DOT director to being a contractor working for DOT. So that was, I was undergoing my own adjustment, and I was mindful of that. One of the things I did was to ask Tom Lauer, who was the manager of the major projects section, a very senior engineer, if I could interview individually everybody in each section. And I had about 30 people. One, that was going to be time consuming, and 2, I was a consultant and a contractor. I was not a DOT employee. I was not a public employee. Tom and I talked about that later. He had to think about that a lot. Did he want me talking individually to his own employees? And he allowed that. Now, this is, if people can't trust you to hold what they have to say in confidence and use good judgment, they're not going to trust you. They are not going to be open and honest with you. And that's one of the people skills I think I bring, is to, you listen to people and you maintain their confidence. You take what you need to make things better. But you have to do it. Tom allowed me to do it, and I recognized there was risk for them. And I did that, and that took 2 or 3 weeks. It was 30 minutes to an hour an individual. There were some people that were, they weren't really going to talk openly. Most of them did. which was remarkable. That told me something. Parallel to that, I was interviewing, we had 250 people on staff, 900 if you counted part-times and TDY. So I had my own big joint venture staff, half floor and half HDR, and I was an HDR employee. So as you can imagine, there was a little standoffishness by the floor employees. You know, after this thing was over. So I ended up visiting, and it took a long period of time with all of the employees in the joint venture, if not individually at a more senior level, then as small groups. And it was just to do that. Here's who I am. I'm presenting myself. Tell me what you think. Ask some open-ended questions. I learned a lot, and that's really where it came to the fore. To say, all right, there may be a couple of personalities here, but they're people issues. They're really not technical issues. We're not aligned. We're not working together. So then what? So what we did, and I took my leadership team in this case, and there was a negative side to this, but if I remember, I'll tell you about this. I took them off-site for a couple of days, and I said, we've got some issues here, and how are we going to improve? It was a round table, probably about the same number of people, and we chunked down what we thought the issues were. It was a lot of discussion, and identified, okay, here's the issue, here's the corrective action, and here's the person that's going to take the lead on it. Here's the plan to get from here to there. And so we did that. And I'm going to say, again, this is to repair relationships and to make them what you would like. It took the better part of a year. And so that's what we did. And it was, you know, we'd revisit those plans. All right, how are we doing? We probably made some adjustments over that course of the year. Here's the client, Tom and others asking me, well, John, what do you think we need to be doing? Well, that kind of took my breath away because I'm working for them, not vice versa. But the fact that they trusted me to ask for my input, and I felt comfortable in giving it to them, that whole process began to work. Two-way communications, trust, and mutual respect. At the end of that year, he said, all right, so what happened as a result of all those efforts? And I'm oversimplifying it because it was hard, day-to-day work. Required a lot of resilience. You run into obstacles on any given day, and sometimes you go, oh, I've had it. You can't do this. So you got to have a certain amount of resilience, mental resilience. Keep going. Keep pushing forward. At the end of that year, we got at one point in time, there was,
Mr. Craig,
I'm sorry?
you got about 3 minutes left, and you got 2 more questions, and we want to give you some time, so you really need to wrap this
I got it. No, it's a good point. We were $58 million over budget. When you're over budget, anybody's going to be concerned, right? So at the end of that year, we were under budget. We got a 4-year contract extension, so it was kind of the signal we're onto a good path. So I'll stop there. There were some results from those efforts to turn things around as you spoke to.
Describe your experience working with collective bargaining units.
In Oregon, now I'll leave that one alone from that was a little bit different. In Nebraska, there is Public Employees Union, and for many of the years, the senior person in the Public Employees Union happened to be one of my employees. Once I became aware of that, began to meet with him, and again, it's based on a relationship. We spoke honestly and openly. You know, there were things we could do and things we couldn't, and I was constrained because I was working under state government. The specific negotiations, I would be requested for my input by the governor as representative. And then the representative for all of state government would actually do the hands-on negotiation. But back in the background, I was talking to my guy. And I would say that regardless of how things turned out, this is true in my experience as well, we maintained the strong relationship. We couldn't always agree. We couldn't, you know, there were limits on what either one of us could do, but we spoke honestly and openly, and so that was my experience. I had some limitations to be sure, but I certainly have experience in doing that.
Describe your ability or experience in creating or expanding existing business relationships with key organizations, government agencies, corporate executives, and the public.
I think I've already spoken to that. A lot of outreach with almost anybody and everybody I could find. Fire departments, law enforcement, cities, counties, state legislature, developers, other businesses, railroads, in the transportation business, similar for utilities directly. You have an impact on everybody. It's unavoidable. Who doesn't need potable water? Everybody does. It's the biggest issue in India, which I've been to too. So that's an easy one. That's one of the skill sets I bring in is doing outreach and finding ways to build the broader team so that everybody's pulling in the same direction as much as humanly possible.
Those are all the questions that we have for you, and unfortunately, it looks like our hour's expired. Mr. Chair, if you want to follow up with.
I think that we can just a couple of more minutes. If you have any questions of us, we would like to give you that opportunity and not just,
Well, thank you. And I apologize for spending more time here talking. It's not my main mode. What would you consider to be the biggest issue that needs addressing by MUD?
infrastructure replacement.
Yeah.
If you
Not enough funding.
ask me to list one, the speed with which we need to do it and how we're gonna pay for it.
Got it. That makes sense. I could have almost guessed that, but I appreciate that feedback. So the only other question I'll ask is, I want to be careful how I ask this too. What would you like the next president to do more of? Or is there anything?
I think it depends on which board member you ask. Everybody's got their own specialty, and that's the dicey nature, if there is one, of a person that would be in the position of president in a public utility like this, is you're dealing with 7 elected officials, and they've all got a little bit different view of
Understand.
how they'd like to see that. So you try to find majorities where you can work and please all of them if you can, and most of them if you can't.
It makes sense. I understand that. I think I'll stop there. There are lots of other questions I've got, I think. But again, I appreciate the opportunity to interview, and thank you.
Thanks for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you worked under Governor Heineman.
I did, and Mike Johans.
Oh,
Those were